I see no thumbs down. That's a good sign. Am I echoing?
A little bit.
A little? All right. I think I have to stay in range of this. How's that? Any better? Okay. All right. Good evening, my curious friends. Thank you so much for coming. There was a man buried here who came to live in Troy around 1863. His name was Ypsilanti Alexander Smith. Imagine spelling that in your kindergarten class. Wouldn't it be fun? His first name, Ypsilanti, was a toast to the sagacious general in the Greek War for Independence, Demetrius Ypsilanti. His middle name, Alexander, was a nod to the insatiable young ruler, Alexander the Great, the one who wept when there were no more worlds to conquer. Fleeting shadows of these leaders would at times manifest in the life and legacy of our Ypsilanti Smith. But I'm getting ahead of myself. When he came to Troy, interestingly, he lived as a hermit on Union Street here in town, with only a cat as his companion.
Amen.
His abode was known as a miserable hovel or a hut. Ypsilanti himself was said to have been reclusive, miserly, unshaven, and very strange. He was an enigma to the world around him, and truly, try as they might, people could not understand his tragic and detached nature. The only substantial human interaction he had in his years here in Troy was in the company of his niece, Mrs. Ella Baines. She was the daughter of his sister Mary, who was the wife of Joseph R. John, who we're discussing next on the tour. The windows of Ypsilanti's small home were constantly boarded up, and he became increasingly paranoid that people were going to steal from him or kill him in the middle of the night. He would beg for spare clothing, food, and other necessities from his neighbors, who at times obliged his humble request. They would shake their heads and perhaps think, "That poor man, he must be destitute." However, there was a rumor on a few people's lips around town that he was actually very rich and had millions tucked away in his filthy and unassuming hut. You might be wondering how we got to this point, how Ypsilanti came to be the town eccentric, the lowly, miserable, forgotten castaway. Well, you might be interested to know that this was not the path he started out on. In fact, he had showed great promise early in life, and he was destined for greatness. I will tell you a bit about the man that he used to be. So Ypsilanti Smith was born in 1827 to parents Isaac and Margaret. Their social standing was commendable, and they had the means with which to send their son to Harvard University. Ypsilanti would graduate from there with honors in 1849 and then moved to Bellefontaine, Ohio to begin his legal career at age 22. Astute, refined, and scholarly, he had little time for romantic pursuits in the midst of his blossoming legal career. But then, love does not always wait for us to be ready. I met Ypsilanti, and in him I found a dependable ally, an intellectual sparring partner, and a true friend. He had finally looked up from his legal textbook long enough to notice me. So from thence we fell in love. My name is Caroline Davenport, and I married the renowned Ypsilanti Smith in the spring of 1852. My father, Matthew Davenport, was the Justice of the Peace in my home state of Massachusetts, and he joyfully presided over our wedding ceremony. Me and Ypsilanti settled in Bellefontaine, where his legal practice was thriving. I was a respectable young lady, and my husband Ypsilanti was known as a well-educated and tasteful gentleman of culture and refinement. We would soon realize that there was to be another member added to our family in due time, as I found out I was with child. Maggie Lawson Smith would be born to us in the spring of 1853, and what a joyous light she was in our lives. Our cup was brimming over with gratitude, and you can imagine the euphoria that characterizes a time like this. Perhaps you too have been there. However, perhaps you detect that there is tragedy just around the bend. If you surmised as such, you are correct. When our Maggie was just 4 years old, she was struck with what doctors could only term a brain disease, and this would claim her life in June of 1857. 6 months later, when we were still in the throes of crippling grief, an attack of consumption or tuberculosis would wrench life from me, leaving my husband without his wife and his child. We can only speculate whether death came to me and my little one as the ghastly specter we all fear, or if perhaps it came gently like an old friend. As you can imagine, my husband's grief was immense, and it was hard to believe that fate could be so cruel. Ypsilanti's career began floundering, and he even fell into some legal trouble of his own. Soon he decided to relocate to Troy, where his sister lived, to try and begin anew. When he came to Troy around 1863, the Civil War was still raging on. The Emancipation Proclamation had been signed, conscription or the military draft had gone into effect, and Gettysburg was just around the corner. My dear husband, Ypsilanti Smith, who at this time was nearing 36 years of age, was called on to serve and was mustered into the 147th Ohio Volunteer Infantry on May 2nd, 1864. They were a 100 days unit who were assigned to guard forts and other strategically important sites for the Union Army, thus freeing up more highly trained soldiers to attack offensively. Ypsilanti was mustered out of service in August of '64 at Camp Dennison near Cincinnati. It was said that he walked home to Troy in order to save money. To each their own, right? In these post-war years, it is probable that Ypsilanti's peculiarities continued to mount. He was noted here in Troy as a brilliant lawyer, and he still practiced periodically, sometimes presiding over real estate transfers and the like. He fell into a bit more legal trouble here when in 1882, he accidentally rented a property to a Kate Klingon that was used as a house of ill repute. But over time, he simply backed away from the public stage and quit his law practice altogether. Most people could not get past the tragic and aloof nature he possessed. They didn't know his backstory, nor could he be compelled to talk of it. His shack on Union Street, as I mentioned, was wretched, and his general appearance warranted alarm as the years wore on. He became more and more reclusive, and would disappear from Troy for days at a time. At one such time as this, the Lima, Ohio newspaper reported that old Ypsilanti Smith of Troy was in the city today again on one of his periodical tramps through the country. He is accredited with being worth nearly $250,000 and does nothing but tramp around the country. The Lima News, 28 November, 1888. Another newspaper in Findlay claimed that Ypsilanti had a large amount of money loaned out in Hancock County. Such was the mysterious existence of our Mr. Smith. In 1889, he applied for his Civil War pension, claiming disability. In 1891, it was published in the Miami Union newspaper that he was terribly paranoid that his neighbors, the Shunks, were going to steal the plate glass of his windows. Tell me the last time you worried about that, folks. And ask Sandy if you get a chance who the Shunks are. They may or may not be Hurricane. By 1900, he was nearing his 73rd year of age. Ypsilanti rarely ventured out, and when he did, it tended to create quite a stir. It was in December of the year 1900 that he took quite ill with pneumonia, and the newspapers were reporting that the situation looked grim for him. The niece I mentioned, Ella, insisted that he move in with her while he was ailing, but naturally he declined. Soon after, he disappeared again, and people began to talk. It was discovered that he had made his residence in Fletcher at the Garbury farm, and that he died there only days before Christmas on December 22nd, 1900. Death, the great equalizer, had struck again, heedless of age, rank, or social status. A sizable and sensational obituary was run in the Buckeye newspaper a few days later. It told the story of his life that people did not know. How he came from a prominent New York family and graduated with honors from Harvard Law. How he became a notable attorney with an established practice. How he fell in love and married only to have the mirage vanish before him. How he lost his mind with grief after losing both wife and child, and slowly grew more and more eccentric. The obituary exposed that in his lifetime here, he had bought up several very lucrative pieces of land, including land in Michigan that was being leased to none other than John D. Rockefeller of the Standard Oil Company. It confirmed that he was indeed a very rich man at the time of his death, and he had nearly $4 million in today's money. The men assigned to clean out his hut discovered a locked, chained-up iron chest while they were cleaning out street rubbish from his home. There were thousands in government bonds and other monies. And what became of this wealth, you may ask? Well, as you can imagine, many people were very interested in coming forward and claiming kinship to Mr. Smith. But do you want to know something strange? Ypsilanti, the esteemed lawyer, had not drawn up a will. Thus, an estate was issued. Some Smith relations were tracked down, as well as some of my Davenport relations. It was supposed, too, that some of the money would go to Harvard. He was laid to rest here in Rose Hill Cemetery, and as you can see, his grave marker is large, stunning, and ornate. This, of course, is a substantial contrast to the way Ypsilanti lived life, but perhaps it was his posthumous attempt at poetic irony. One never knows. A final toast to his fledgling legacy. So now you have my husband's story, and strange as it may seem, it is a true account. He lived, breathed, and walked the streets of Troy as you do today. Hopefully now that his hidden story has been revealed, we can better consider the hidden story that each person carries with them. That's all I've got. We don't have to move far, we just have to shift over a few feet here. Patrick's going to talk about our next person.